Thank you very much, Chris. Terrific time. Boy, what a great time. I thought last year was fantastic. This year has topped it. So many great people that I've gotten to know just over the intervening year. As Chris said, my name is Gardner Goldsmith, and you might be familiar with me from the Liberty Conspiracy website or Free Talk Live, where Ian and Mark are gracious enough to let me sit in with them on Mondays when I can make it over to Keene. And thank you very much to those guys. And yes, Amazon.freetalklive.com is terrific. I'm here, as Chris mentioned, because, well, for a number of reasons. First, because I want to congregate with, as Glenn Jacobs said earlier, the Legions of Liberty. I just thought that that was a fantastic statement. If you didn't get to see Glenn Jacobs speak earlier, totally fantastic speech about economics, the Austrian School of Economics, and the world in which we live right now because of government and how it affects our lives. And many of us came to this spot here, philosophically, geographically, temporally, because of various stimuli, various reasons, whether it was because we were brought up by libertarians, we were brought up by paleoconservatives or liberals or whatever. We fought our teachers in the government schools. I used to have one who used to pull my hair when I would talk about how FDR's alphabet soups of agencies weren't doing anything to help people back then. She almost poured a soda over my head, and that's what happened. But, you know, I realized that ours is a tradition of individual liberty. That's individual liberty. Ridley Ruwart.
He's audio recording.
And I gotta say, there is a lineage of philosophers, political philosophers, and economists who articulated things, and we stand upon their shoulders. And you know, sometimes it almost gets me choked up to think about some of the things that they went through, and some of the things they passed on to us. Some of these ideas we spontaneously came up with ourselves, but others were passed on to us. People like John Locke, well, people like Aristotle. I mean, Aristotle was the first one to talk about the right to self-defense. Aristotle, heck of a lot better than Socrates and Plato, I'll tell you that. Just see the Watchmen, you'll know what I mean. And he didn't need any parable of the cave to express it. John Locke, Frederick Bastiat, Thomas Paine, Adam Smith, Lysander Spooner, Karl Menger, Ludwig von Mises, F.A. Hayek, Albert J. Nock, Ayn Rand, Henry Hazlitt, Murray Rothbard, so many more went through their times of troubles trying to raise families, begin families, do their businesses. Who knows what was going on in their lives? Frederick Bastiat, the last 5 years of his life, boom, he produced some of the most brilliant things ever in the history of man before he died from tuberculosis. And to think about the way those people sacrificed really energized me. And so, thanks to the work of Jeremy Furbish, who was a Free State member, some of you might know Ferb. Ferb! Hello, Ferb! This tradition of highlighting and concentrating attention on pro-freedom thinking, as articulated in books, has been turned into the Freedom Book Club, freedombookclub.com. And Ferb approached me, and he said, Gard, he knew me, he used to listen to me on my radio program, and he decided to apply his skills to promoting today's libertarian writers, and he created the Freedom Book Club. It's a website where libertarians can go and visit, and each month vote on a book that they would like to see promoted in the mainstream, to see the concentrated buying power of libertarian people who will consistently try to make an effort to go there. Maybe they won't buy it every month, but they'll try to pick up the book that's voted on. It's a tacit agreement that, you know what, you vote, give it a shot. And it concentrates buying power on that book, the way Ron Paul's Book Bomb was so successful. And of course, Ron Paul was very successful as well in the way that he put that book together. So, this year, for the first year, the Freedom Book Club has made the extra effort to do two things. First, to celebrate the Freedom Book Club Book of the Year, those people who visited the website were given the opportunity to vote on all those books that were up each month. Which book do you think is the one that you would say deserves the greatest recognition for freedom?
The law lasts!
Yeah, good point. Absolutely. We'll have to get into an abstract discussion later. And so what he has done, they have selected one book. All the votes are in for the Freedom Book Club Book of the Year for 2008 going into 2009. It has not been mentioned on the website. It will be mentioned tonight. And the award will be given out tonight. He is also doing something I wanted to mention to you. He has produced the second chance ballot for those books that did not make the Freedom Book Club Book of the Year. But people really like them nonetheless. People can log online, and the balloting will end, I believe, at the end of March, the 31st. They can vote right here. As Chris worked on this, you've got it in your packets, and you can drop off your vote for the book of the follow-up book of the year over in that box. Liz, right?
And then Liz.
Yes, Liz, where's Liz? Okay, Liz, oh, very nice. I like it with the hands. Very good. Yeah, oh, what's that? Oh, and they'll be at registration tomorrow. The box will be there. Okay, great. So if you haven't dropped off, please do take the time to vote, because this will be for a second chance book, and it will, again, it'll be a wonderful thing to really attract attention to that particular book. Now, the question, what is the book of the year? What is the book that all the people who visited this website from all around the world decided deserved the recognition for the greatest work promoting freedom that was promoted at the website? There were a lot of competitors: Ron Paul, Randy Barnett, Thomas DiLorenzo, Murray Rothbard, F. Paul Wilson, and the winner, the author of a book that you might have seen outside, and our next speaker is the recipient of the 2008 Freedom Book Club Book of the Year Award, Dr. Mary Ruwart, for healing our world in an age of aggression.
Tommaso from the LPNH. I hope everyone's having a good time and getting far more sleep than all those of us who are organizing this. I was thinking today that the Free State Project is just a little over 5 years old. This is our third Liberty Forum. We're having this meteoric rise in success. I remember when we only had 6 or 7 of us in this state fighting for liberty, and now I checked the counter and we're close to 700 in New Hampshire now to the Free State Project. Those of us who are natives and welcome you, thank you from the bottom of our hearts, because believe me, the fight is not over yet and we need all the help we can get. Speaking of the fight, Mary Brewer is probably a woman who doesn't need a lot of any introduction to the crowd, but for the 3 or 4 of you who might not know who she is a woman who has talked the talk and walked the walk. She's run for office, the state and federal level. She even ran for the Board of Education. Could you imagine Mary Ruwart on a Board of Education? And her most recent run for office was she competed for the LP presidential nomination. And a little trivia fact, some of you may not know, New Hampshire pledged the very first delegate to that convention for Mary Ruwart. The topic of Mary's speech tonight is the deadly secrets about soaring pharmaceutical prices. She has worked for 25 years in medical research, 19 of those with Upjohn, specifically on pharmaceutical research. So she definitely knows her stuff, and I think that's all I really need to say. So, Mary Ruwart, everybody.
Well, thank you. I have to tell you, I was very surprised by this award. They kept it a total secret from me. Until they announced my name, I wasn't... Yeah. I didn't even expect it. So I want to thank you all for your votes. And, well, I'm just thrilled. What can I say? So today, my topic, of course, is deadly secrets behind soaring pharmaceutical prices. But everything I'm going to say about pharmaceutical prices applies to the entire medical sector. It's just that we can see it a little more clearly with pharmaceuticals. So if I could have the first slide, I'm going to talk to you about what what it is I'm going to say today. You know, and I have a little bit of trouble reading from here, so basically what I'm going to show you in the next half hour is that pharmaceutical regulations account for about 80% or even more of the current pharmaceutical prices that you pay when you go to the drugstore. These regulations, although they were passed to make drugs safer, have actually made them less safe. And they have really slashed innovation. This is probably one of their biggest problems, in addition to slashing prevention, which we'll talk about a little later. And there's been a number of other things too. You know, basically about 20% of the US population that have died since 1962 when these regulations were passed were probably adversely affected. Their lives were shortened by these regulations. And so, as you can see, they've probably, as you might imagine when you start thinking about this, they've probably doubled the healthcare costs because it's much cheaper to take a pill than it is to go to the hospital. And they've really made healthcare rationing a necessity. We'll talk a little more about that later on. And of course, as in every situation when you regulate business, you create a cartel, and that's true in the pharmaceutical industry as well. Now, on the next slide, you'll see that basically the changes that created all of this happened in 1962, the Kefauver-Harris amendments. And you go and click right down the whole list there. These amendments were supposed to address the idea of effectiveness. Prior to their passage, you only had to show that a drug was safe for its intended use before you could market it. You didn't have to show that it worked. But a lot of other things happened too. The FDA dictated how you had to do your animal testing and how much. And it also required an employee to sign off on the approval, so there was somebody to point to if something went wrong. Whereas before, if no FDA employee objected, basically the drug could go on the market. And in addition, the FDA got the ability to tell manufacturers how they could advertise their drug and how they could label their drug. And that's why when you look on television, you see these ads for the drug companies, you see this big laundry list of side effects because that's FDA mandated. And finally, FDA had oversight of manufacturing. Before these laws were passed, basically, unless somebody lied about what they put in it, the FDA couldn't do anything. One of the first things the FDA did when these laws were passed is they put 50% of the manufacturers out of business for manufacturer violations, which simply meant not that the drug was not there or not in the right amount, but that the FDA didn't like the way manufacturers documented their process. Now, one of the interesting things about this whole thing, as you can see in the next slide, is this emphasis on effectiveness, which is how most people actually know about the Kefauver-Harris amendments. But you know, drug effectiveness is very difficult. I mean, does it have to be effective in everyone to be considered effective, or most of the time, or sometimes? And is it effective on its own, or do you have to compare it with placebo? In the next slide, you'll see this little cartoon. It's a fake. Can't see the top. It says, FDA approved sale of prescription placebo. Now, this is a fake drug ad, okay? This is something that The Onion in Austin put together, and you can actually find it on their website. But it looks just like a regular drug ad. And let's see, if my laser pointer that isn't really laser works here, I want you to look at this ad. You see it's for sucrosa. Sucrose is the name for sugar. And notice the tagline, it will work. And that's what placebos do, they work. That's why we run placebo-controlled trials, because you can give people a sugar pill and some of them will respond favorably. So there's really no such thing as a drug that isn't effective, and there's no such thing as false hope, because the placebo effect is a real effect. We just don't understand it, so we don't talk about it much. And that's probably why the Supreme Court in the early 1900s actually ruled that laws demanding effectiveness testing in drugs were not constitutional because effectiveness was a matter of opinion. You know? But however, the FDA in the 1962 Kefauver-Harris amendments managed to get around that. Now this created some problems as shown in the next slide, and the biggest problem it created was that it increased the development time of drugs from 4.5 years, as seen in the light blue squares, which is what it was in the 60s, or I'm sorry, what it was prior to the 60s. And then as you see these dark red squares, you can see that every year the development time went up and up, because basically this was a blanket charge for the FDA. They'd increase regulations every time, and the drug companies couldn't even sue, because the Upjohn company, the one I worked for prior to the time I joined it, actually tried to take the FDA to court and say, hey, you can't impose these regulations willy-nilly. There has to be some system here. And they used one of their drugs as an example, but the courts ruled that the FDA did have the power to impose these regulations, and the drug companies would have no recourse. So that really gave the FDA carte blanche, and every year they increase the regulations. Why? Because if anything goes wrong with a drug, and every single drug has a side effect of some sort, and Congress's attention is focused on that side effect, guess who has to come and defend themselves? The FDA. So they're really in a bad place. They can't approve a drug that's both safe and effective, because there's no such thing as a drug that's totally safe, and there's no such thing as a drug that's totally effective. So, they stick their neck out every time they approve a drug, so they keep delaying the approvals. And that's what protects them. Now, on the next slide, you might imagine that some people just couldn't wait that extra 10 years. And that was the AIDS community. So they basically opted out, and they did it totally illegally, and they were not stopped. What they did is they started bringing back drugs from overseas, because at that point in time, our FDA was so strict compared to Europe that they could go over to Europe and get the new drugs and bring them back and hopefully be able to treat themselves. But the customs officials would take them away. Well, finally, when this came to light, the FDA commissioner at the time, Frank Young, said, we're not going to be like the Gestapo and go into people's homes and take their drugs away. So he allowed patients, Americans, to go overseas and bring back enough for their own personal use. And he didn't last long at the FDA after that, as you might imagine. And this permission, if you will, is still on the books, but every FDA commissioner treats it a little differently, so you can't really count on being able to do that. Now, what happened after that is when companies like the one I worked for, the Upjohn company, started to develop drugs for AIDS. The AIDS community didn't want to wait that extra 10 years for it to get on the market, so they just hired black market chemists to make them. Consequently, when we finally had a new drug and we wanted to put it in people, we found that every AIDS patient in the country who wanted it already had our drug. So we couldn't do the test because these patients would develop resistance, so we had to wait until new cases were diagnosed to actually run the tests that the FDA required of us. Now, what's interesting is these people actually had a very admirable safety record, and they really, in spite of the fact that they were breaking the law and everyone knew it, and Times Magazine ran articles on them, nobody did anything because the FDA didn't want to have a hullabaloo, which the AIDS activists would have created, and letting people know that these delays were killing people. And the pharmaceutical companies weren't about to do it either, because these are their future patients. So they got away with this. In fact, I understand there's a Brad Pitt movie coming out called The Dallas Buyers Club, which tells this story. And actually, if you notice at the bottom of the slide, the author Whitney actually wrote a book called Acceptable Risks, in which he describes the evolution of this AIDS community opt-out. So if people are dying, waiting for these new drugs, just how many are there? Well, the next slide shows the calculations. You can actually do these because we know how many people are helped by drugs. Now, don't bother looking at the calculations other than the bottom line. 4.7 million people have died waiting for drugs that we know are effective because of this 10-year delay, on average. This is a lot of people. And you might ask yourself, gee, is that it, or is there more? Well, there's more. There's a lot more. In fact, the next slide shows that what are we doing? 2 slides? Yeah. Let's go back one. Or is that it? Okay, yes. Yes, see, it's not just about new drugs. The slide I showed you with 4.7 million people dying waiting for new drugs, these are new drugs, okay? These are new ones. But you know, there's a lot of old drugs that could be pretty helpful too. You know, aspirin, for example. Right after these 62 amendments were passed, Bayer Aspirin wanted to go and put out a little calendar pack for heart patients because they already were getting information that aspirin might help people with heart disease. But when they found out all the hoops they had to jump through to get approval, they said, we can't do this, it's too expensive, we'll never recover our costs because aspirin is not patentable anymore. And so we're going to lose our money because it's going to go generic the first day. And so because of this, we had, you know, almost a 20-year delay in recognizing aspirin's benefit. And so because of this, you see, because of the high development time and high development costs, which I'm going to show in a minute, patents have become indispensable, really, in the drug development industry. And they didn't used to be. When I started, we were still developing drugs without patents. Now, the other thing is these regulations were passed in the wake of the thalidomide tragedy. There was a drug put out in Europe, which when pregnant women took it, created problems with the fetus. They would be born with either without limbs or with shriveled limbs. And that was, of course, very, very sad. But these regulations did nothing to stop that kind of thing. In fact, they actually created what I call the American thalidomide. What is that? Well, we knew actually since the early 80s, that if a woman took folic acid before her pregnancy, she could virtually wipe out the chance that her child would have spina bifida. But the FDA wouldn't let the folic acid manufacturers talk about this B vitamin. It's a vitamin, for heaven's sakes. It's not a drug. Because if they did, without jumping through all these regulatory hoops, then they felt they'd have to let the pharmaceutical companies have a shortened path too. So they said, well, no, you have to go through all these regulations. Of course, folic acid isn't patentable either. So as a consequence, even after the Center for Disease Control, another government agency, started recommending that women of childbearing potential, take folic acid every day, just in case they got pregnant, the FDA told the folic acid manufacturers that they'd shut them down if they even mentioned this. Consequently, the American public was not educated about this for about 12, 15 years. And we had more babies born with spina bifida than we ever had thalidomide babies. And we don't even know how many were aborted, because of course you can test for this in utero, and a lot of those babies were aborted. So the very tragedy that these amendments were supposed to prevent actually created something right here in the US. Whereas thalidomide was mostly in Europe, we created it here with our FDA. Now, you might say, well, but weren't there some lives saved by these regulations? Well, there might have been a few. In the next slide, we calculate exactly how many we think there might be. And if you scroll down on this slide a little bit, you'll see the bottom line, which is that if you look at all the things that happened before 1962, and you try to calculate what it would be over the years these amendments were in effect, then you see that maybe about 7,000 lives would have been saved. 7,000. Now, even if this estimate's off by a factor of 100, and you multiply by 100, and you get something like 700,000, it's still a lot less than that 4.7 million of people who just died waiting. And I've just begun to tell you the bad news. I have only just begun, unfortunately. Now, why is this? Well, if you look at the next slide, you see why unsafe drugs get to market. And basically, the thing is that most of the safety testing in the 60s was adequate for our state of knowledge. But the problem is, and I see we have a technical problem too, the problem is that we didn't have enough science to predict the thalidomide tragedy. Thalidomide only has those effects in primates and in one strain of rabbits. So it didn't matter how many laboratory animal studies were done, it would never have been picked up. We only began to appreciate with the thalidomide tragedy that there was indeed a problem. So that's what happens today as well. If we can predict it from animal studies, we don't develop the drug. But if we can't, and that happens a lot because people are not rats, as much as we might think so at times. So, it's not possible really to predict everything. So every time you take a drug, you want to want to remember that there are some risks involved. It's not just safety free. Okay, there we go. All right, we're back in business. So now that we have this slide, we'll go to the next one. And basically, what I'm showing here, we're not going to get real fancy here, but basically what I'm showing is that if we had had the same development costs that were happening before 62, you see this line here is what we would have predicted out here in the 2000s if the pre-amendment development cost trends had continued. If these amendments hadn't been passed, we'd be somewhere around here. But because the amendments were passed, look at this dramatic increase in cost for development for new drugs. Well, of course you would expect it based on the increase in time. That's nothing new. But if you look at the next slide, what you see is these development costs are linked totally to what we pay our pharmacist. There's a correlation, a very tight correlation between the R&D cost of a drug and what you're charged at the pharmacy. That's one way that manufacturers calculate what they're going to charge you. Of course, they have to take into account all the failures too. So it's not just that one drug. So it does make a difference how much you regulate. It influences what you pay at the pharmacy, and that's why drug costs are so high. In fact, the next slide, you basically see the summary of this whole thing, which that if pre-amendment trends had continued, the price you pay at the pharmacy would be about 15% of what we pay today. That's a huge increase. It's huge. Now, you might say, well, we'd be willing to pay this extra money if all this effectiveness testing actually saved us money on wasteful drugs that didn't work. But studies show that prior to 1962, only about 10% of the drugs really weren't very effective. And that's actually a generous estimate. 10%. Because the marketplace had already taken care of it. You know, physicians saw their patients were benefiting, they didn't prescribe it. So the marketplace was already regulating it well enough. Now, I told you I had only just begun. So now we're going to start doing the heavy hitting. The next slide talks about what really matters, loss of innovation. Innovation has been at least cut in half. Why is this important? Well, the first anti-ulcer disease drug that came out cost about $1,000 a year. Usually you had to take 2 courses, $2,000. That's a lot of money. But it wasn't as much as the surgery. The surgery was $25,000 and you had to be out of work for a while. So there's a big, big difference in cost when you can take a pharmaceutical. So when innovation is halted, that means cost goes up because instead of paying for the drug, you pay for hospitalization or surgery. And breakthrough drugs especially are not developed. Let me tell you a true life story. I was working on prostaglandins for liver disease. And I filed a patent. You know, we had gotten into the phase where you had to get patent protection for these things by that time in my career. And the FDA examiner for my section actually called me up, which is very unusual, and said, Dr. Ruwart, we understand you have a patent for prostaglandins and liver disease that's been filed. I said, yes, that's true. That's what my research shows. They said, oh, we are so happy to hear this because so many people die of liver disease and there's nothing. We have to prescribe bed rest. That's it. That's the best we can do. So we're really excited about your new drug and we're going to do everything we can to help you develop it. Wow, I thought maybe we have a chance here. But you know, that didn't mean they were going to waive the regulations. No, that just meant they'd look at our data sooner. Well, you know, liver disease, especially the kind we were dealing with, chronic liver disease, you know, for like from alcoholism, HIV, well, of course, HIV wasn't around too much then, but hepatitis. What that does, it takes a long time to develop. And, you know, basically the liver gets all scarred. So it takes a long time for that scar tissue to go away. So we knew we were going to have to do a study that lasted several years in order to show the effectiveness of our drug. And, you know, some of these people, if they're alcoholics, aren't always compliant. You know, they don't always take their drug. So we had to back off a little bit and add more people so that we could get the statistical significance that the FDA required. You had to have so many people in the study to have that. And we didn't know what dose we needed. Nobody had ever cured liver disease before. We were breaking, you know, new ground here. We weren't sure what to measure. And if we guessed wrong on any of this, we'd have to start over because we had to have the statistical significance in 2 U.S. studies in order to market this drug. Well, by the time we calculated the time course, if we had had to start over, we quickly realized that unless we guessed right the first time, this drug would be off patent by the time it got to market, which meant it would go generic and we'd never recover our costs. So the company, probably wisely, although it broke everyone's heart to do it, decided not to develop it. This is how new innovation gets killed in today's regulatory market. Silently. Nobody knows. And how much does that cost us? The next slide does a calculation on this to see. And basically, again, I'm going to just ask you to look at these bottom two lines. What we're doing is we're estimating how many people are affected or how much money it costs, depending on if you think these missing drugs are 25, 50, or 100% as effective as the ones that are now on the market. And as you can see, the numbers are staggering. Even if you assume that the drugs that we're missing from innovation are only 25% as effective as the ones we have now, that's another 4.1 million people. If you think they're 100% as effective, these new missing drugs, then we're talking about 16 million people. 3 to 4 times what loss of life we've experienced just due to the delays. So you can see the innovation component is a very big component of this whole thing. And it's rarely measured, rarely talked about. And of course the cost, the money cost of having to turn to surgery or hospitalization. If you go to the next slide, you can see I've summed this up for you because we don't have time to go into all the numbers. But basically, 25 to 55% of today's healthcare costs are directly related to the loss of innovation that we experience due to the 1962 Kefauver-Harris amendments. That's huge. If you want to bring healthcare costs down, it's easy to do. In fact, the next slide has a quote that I really like by William Wardell, and he says if even one new drug, the stature of penicillin or digitalis, has been unjustifiably banished to a company's back shelf because of these excessive regulatory requirements, that event would harm more people than all of the drug toxicity in the history of modern drug development. And you know it's happened. You know it's happened, just from the little bit of example I've shared with you. So now if we go to the next slide, you can see where we got all this information that I talked about earlier about accounting for how these regulations account for 80% or more of current drug costs, have made drugs less safe, have slashed innovation in half, have shortened the lives of about 20% of our population that have died since these things were put in, and have probably doubled general health care costs. I like the next slide where Dale Greninger in the Wall Street Journal says that economic studies have been virtually unanimous. FDA regulations certainly cannot be proved safe and effective, thereby flunking their own criteria. But you know, it gets worse. Yeah, it just gets worse. The next slide really goes into it. You know, we talked about the folic acid story being the American thalidomide. It's very difficult to even get an estimate of this, but you know, proper nutrition is so important. At the Upjohn Company, what we had to do to make our animals sick was to take their vitamins away. Why? Because we titrated their diet very carefully, made them very healthy, and we couldn't make them sick. We had to take their vitamins away. That was the only way we could make them sick. Now that should tell you something. Like maybe we don't have enough vitamins in our diet. Maybe that's it. But the problem is, if you want to promote a vitamin for a particular disease, and there are many in which the vitamins work very well, and the drug companies used to manufacture them and promote them, but all of a sudden they couldn't do it because if they wanted to make a claim of effectiveness, they had to jump through all these hoops and pay all this money, and they couldn't patent the vitamins, so they couldn't do it without it going generic the first day. Now, you might imagine that if we had the proper nutrition, that the problems we have from alcohol, for example, wouldn't exist. In fact, part of my work was showing that you could prevent most alcoholic liver disease by simply beefing up the nutritional mix that your animals took. And this is true actually even in primates, so it does apply to humans. And if you know anything about drug development, you know that most drugs that you take today are actually mimics of natural substances. They're longer acting substances in your body, or vitamins. They take a vitamin or they take something that's in your body and they change it chemically so they can get a patent and it lasts longer in your body. And that's what most drugs are today. So think about if you could use a natural substance, much cheaper. And of course, we can rarely study them or do anything with them because we can't make those claims. Now, in the next slide, you can see something that really should give all us political activists heart. When the FDA tried not only to just deny vitamin manufacturers the ability to make claims, but actually started getting pretty aggressive about working with them and trying to say that all nutritional supplements had to go through the development process, there was an outcry from the public, which actually resulted in the Dietary Supplement Health and Education Act, which was passed in '94. Congress got the largest citizen response they ever had. People who take vitamins really know about liberty. In that sector, at least, they should be prime targets for us. They hate the FDA. And this was passed, and what it does is it categorizes supplements as food, not drugs, and that means that the FDA can't push them through the drug process. But this is actually being threatened, as shown in the next slide. There is actually an international harmonization effort underway called Codex, which is a joint product of the United Nations, World Health Organization, and Food and Agriculture Organization. And they're developing these guidelines through the WTO, the World Trade Organization. And they've already been adopted in Germany, and the EU is being pushed to adopt them. Now the next slide shows what these regulations do. They limit the amount of vitamins that you can buy without a prescription. In Germany, if you go over these amounts, you got to get a prescription, got to go see your doctor. Now any of you who take vitamins in this room know how crazy this is. I mean, vitamin C, 225 milligrams. Linus Pauling took 10 grams a day, 10,000 milligrams, okay? I take about 2,000 milligrams a day. Yeah, 4,000. Vitamin E, a lot of us take around 800 international units a day because that's what's been shown to prevent platelet aggregation, the initiating event in heart attacks. So you can see that limiting these things is going to have a big impact on health. And in Germany, it's already there. Now, on the next slide, you can see what Ron Paul's doing about this. I really love this. HR 2117. He didn't get to talk about this much when he was campaigning. But basically, this Health Freedom Act allows vitamin manufacturers to make claims as long as unless there's absolutely nothing, no scientific evidence to support them. So basically, he's saying, unless there's a study out there that says that these things really aren't doing anything, you cannot take them off the market, you can't call them drugs, you can't regulate them. Now, of course, even if this passes, there's going to be a battle between Codex, which is going to be imposed internationally, or at least that's the hope, and what we do in our own country. But I love that Ron Paul is bringing this up and talking about it, and I hope he gets a chance to talk more about it because it hasn't gotten quite enough attention in my mind. I'd like to sum up in the next slide a little bit, just talking about that this actually, again, applies to all healthcare regulation. I've only shown you, I only have time to show you one little part. But all these kinds of things happen in the healthcare industry and other parts of the healthcare industry, and those of you who are physicians, nurses, physician's assistants know this well. It's really the major cause of high healthcare costs. It hurts more people than it helps, and it's resulted in healthcare rationing, especially when the government pays the bill. And I'm going to give some examples in the next slide because it's coming to us. Obama's stimulus bill has a little part that says that there's going to be monitoring of the cost effectiveness of our personal medical treatment. And what's happened whenever government has done that, there's been healthcare rationing based on limiting care to the elderly and infirm. Now, I know there's a lot of people who have been active in the Libertarian Party most of their life sitting in this room, and elderly is where we're headed. So this applies to us. And for example, in Britain, and I think these are mostly Oh, I think I don't know about the hip replacement. The other two are British examples. You know, you now have to go blind in one eye from this macular degeneration before you can get the pharmaceutical drug that will prevent it from happening. Yeah, got to be blind in one eye before it's considered cost-effective to save your other eye. Yes. And kidney dialysis, if you're over 50 in Britain, you have a 1 in 3 chance of getting kidney dialysis. They do not want to give it to you because you're getting a little old and, not as productive anymore, and they've got to do some kind of triage. Yeah. Hip replacements, yes. Young people are more likely to get cosmetic types of treatment than an elderly person is likely to get a hip replacement in some of these places that have socialized medicine. In fact, Oregon actually created a cost-effectiveness list like this and got a lot of flack. Now they've recreated their list, and they're still getting flack because now, of course, a lot of the elderly people and what they need are being moved down the list. And in most socialized countries, you are not allowed to go buy your own health care. So it means going out of the country. So this is very, very sad. Now, the next slide shows another citizen effort to change this. This is the Abigail Alliance's suit. And what they did is they said terminally ill people have a constitutional right to buy drugs after they've been safety tested, but before they've been tested for effectiveness. And this was a group of cancer patients, mostly. They felt they couldn't wait either, just like the AIDS patients, but they wanted to make it legal. So they brought suit against the FDA. And initially, they didn't get a very good response, but they finally got one court to rule for them. And of course, the FDA appealed. The court found against them. And they took it to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court refused to hear it. So the lower ruling stands. There is no such constitutional right as a right to save your own life by buying drugs from manufacturers, even if they're not fully tested. So your disease may kill you before the drug is available, but at least you'll die safe. Well, if they did, I imagine that there is a program in place that the FDA touts a lot about compassionate use and expanded access, but try to get it. But if you're a congressman or a judge, I bet you that you would have that drug pretty quickly. So, this is very sad that they didn't win this. So one of the reasons they didn't is that the FDA in its appeal said this would destroy the drug development industry. It would create havoc. We wouldn't be able to enforce the Kefauver-Harris amendments. Yeah, that would have been okay.
Anarchy, chaos.
Yeah. Life. What it would have meant is life. We're talking here about a matter of life and death. This isn't about a few more taxes. This is about your right to live. That's what this is about. And that's why I put the next slide and the final slide in here. I am the chair of a private IRB in the Austin area. An IRB is an institutional review board. By law, any pharmaceutical company that wants to do a clinical study has to get a group of people called an institutional review board to look at their protocol before they do the study and make sure all the subjects are protected. Some of the things we have to make sure that the drug company is doing is fully inform the people who are in the study. And then we have to make sure that the people can easily opt out of the study at any point in time if they don't like it. And we also have to protect what we call vulnerable populations, like terminally ill people. If the Kefauver-Harris amendments were proposed to our IRB as a protocol that the pharmaceutical firms wanted to do, we would have to say it's unethical and it cannot be done. And yet, it is the law of the land that puts these unethical regulations in place. Now, you might say, where does this attitude come from? It came from the Nuremberg trials. When the Germans experimented on human subjects, people said enough. We want to be sure that people who are experimental subjects, even if they're volunteering for the benefit of mankind, are going to have certain rights, and they're going to have certain information. And ironically, it's part of my job to make sure that happens when it's a pharmaceutical study. And I think it should be my job to help it happen for everyone. Thank you. And if you have questions and if we have time, I'm happy to take them. Yes.
Being somewhat involved in software industry and members of the Software Foundation, I know there seems to be great room for conflicts, or I know you were talking several times about the importance of patent drug industry, whereas in the software industry, you're finding that the whole patent system is destroying innovation in the patent software industry. Do you have any suggestions on how one would resolve the seeming conflict in terms of trying to protect the drug company innovation while still allowing innovation in other fields?
Right. Right. The question is, how do you protect drug innovation basically without the interference of patents? And frankly, the drug industry didn't need patents before we had these regulations. We operated without them because what made a difference to us was being first to the market. Whoever was first to the market with the new drug kept 80 to 90% of the customers, even when the second to market came along. So that was what was important. Well, it's still important. I don't want to say that it isn't. It is. But the problem is, if you don't have a patent, it doesn't matter if you're first to market because you won't be able to recover your costs. The costs are too high. Now, I didn't go into the numbers a whole lot because this isn't the kind of forum in which it's probably appropriate to do that. But what we're talking about is each new drug is costing $500 million out of pocket, or $1 billion if you amortize it, so, or capitalize it as it's called. So, you know, the drug companies only have a prayer of recovering their costs if they have a monopoly for a short time. But they wouldn't need it if they didn't have to pay all those development costs. And since the development costs that they're paying don't help the American public, there's no reason they should pay them. It's crazy. We're paying to kill ourselves is what we're doing. So that's the resolution I'd see in the pharmaceutical industry and industry too. There's been a couple studies done on this, and the chemical industry and the pharmaceutical industry, both highly regulated industries, are the only ones, I believe, in which there is an effect of patents that's positive. And the only reason I believe that that effect is there is because of the regulation. Get rid of the regulations and you get rid of the need for patents. In fact, you won't want patents because you'll want to just be first to market. That'll be the only thing that'll matter. Yes?
Did you say there's a couple of pharmaceutical companies that benefit from that regulation?
Sure. You know, as we saw in an early slide, the question was, for those who didn't hear it, are there companies that benefit from these regulations? And the answer is yes, the big companies benefit because the smaller companies are put out of business. You know, you can't take $1 billion hit when at the last minute the FDA decides that they're not going to approve your drug unless you're big. So what's happening now in the industry is they're merging. Of course, as they merge, they lay people off, but they're merging and becoming a cartel. You know, basically the monopoly is starting. And it's become because the companies can't survive unless they merge. So that's what's happening there. Yes? Right, the question was, or the comment actually was that the court ruling for the Abigail Alliance only applies to the district in which it was, that the court ruled. And of course that was the District of Columbia. Yeah, well, and of course that's where the FDA is, so that kind of takes care of the whole country is my understanding. Now, the effort's not dead. You can go to the AbigailAlliance.org site and they're still fighting. And that's wonderful. But when you don't have a constitutional right to save your own life by buying something that might help you, it seems that there are forces at work here that have nothing to do with reason. Yes?
Okay, so maybe this is a question about those forces. Your argument is so persuasive that 25% of the Congressional House of Representatives that would listen to you and want a strong example of government effectiveness. And this is it. This is it in a very powerful way. Why aren't we hearing this from some impassioned representatives?
Well, I think that the question was, why aren't we hearing this kind of stuff from an impassioned representative when all this information is out there? And we are. I mean, that's why Ron Paul is sponsoring that bill. But you see, you have to think of the mentality of the bureaucrat, okay? So it's very easy for someone to come forward and say, oh, this drug hurt me. We need to do something about it to make it totally safe. And instead of saying to this person, drugs aren't totally safe, there are going to be problems. You know, you have to think before you take a drug. The FDA website actually, and I have a picture of this out in my Deadly Secrets pamphlet or booklet out there on my table. You can see a picture of the FDA website where it says, safe and effective drugs. Now, we just got done talking about how no drug is safe and effective, yet that's what the FDA is promising. And I think Congress wants to keep that image up, because otherwise they're afraid people are going to say to them, oh, but I want it totally safe, do something. Well, the only way to make sure that there's only safe and effective drugs on the market is to make sure there are no drugs on the market. That's the only way to do it. And this is from somebody who's in the industry. Behind you, you have a question, yes? That's my understanding. Let me repeat that, though, for those who didn't hear it. She said her understanding of the Obama stimulus bill is this cost-effectiveness evaluation applies to everyone, not just people who has health care is paid for by tax money. And that's my understanding also, is that it's very broad. I think, let's go over to the side of the room. This gentleman here.
On a similar note about the stimulus package, are you familiar with the electronic health record provision in that? And if so, what do you think that effect will have on small practices?
Okay. The question is, what do I know about the health, the electronic health information system, and what will it have, effect will it have on small practices? Well, any regulation is going to hurt small businesses. That's just a given. I don't know the details of that other than to say that when all of your information is electronic and it's in a database, which is what it's about, you know, then it's very easy for someone, either a hacker or your favorite government official, to find out, for example, that you need a particular drug to stay alive. And I can't imagine that being anything but detrimental to our freedom. Yes, in there.
You mentioned the AIDS patients being able to go overseas and get drugs, but then it seems that there's this movement now overseas to crack down on regulation. Given these large pharmaceutical companies, given that some of these drugs were for so many years available elsewhere, Canada, Mexico, cheaper because of the regulations here, how has that shifted? Because it doesn't seem like there aren't going to be any places to get cheaper drugs anymore as things centralize.
Right. The comment is, and the question is, you know, how is there going to be any place to get cheaper drugs or new drugs sooner if they're going to harmonize, basically? And the answer is there won't be. If this harmonization is successful, it'll really curtail our health. And we really won't have anywhere to go unless we're extremely rich and can bribe someone, or perhaps go to some Caribbean country which decides it's going to, you know, be a free health state or something. But the problem with that is our United States government has a long reach. And so this is why we need awareness and fighting on this. And this is an issue where we could take this up as a movement, as a party. I mean, this could be very big for us, because there are already a lot of people who feel very strongly. This was the biggest effort that Congress ever saw. This is not small, so it might be we want to think about that. Yes?
I'm sure a lot of people are familiar with what the AARP has been doing
politicized over the past number of years, working for socialized medicine. I was wondering if you might be able to comment on the AMA and the AA, the American Association of Physicians and Surgeons, the difference between how the AMA is becoming politicized too. I don't know if you want to get into that.
Yeah. Well, you know, the question and comment is about the AMA and other groups and how they become politicized. The AMA really began the movement for what they called professional birth control back in the 30s. What they did is they wanted regulations governing physicians, and they wanted to control the medical schools through these governing boards, approval boards. And they were successful, and they reduced the number of physicians down very far, and the reason they wanted to do that was so the price that the physicians could charge could go up. And they were very successful at that. And that's, I think just now they're starting to wake up to the fact that they may have hung themselves, because of course now a lot of physicians are saying, I can't afford to have a practice anymore with all of the legal liability that I have from these lawsuits. That's a whole other story. And I can't afford Medicare patients anymore because the government's now cut back on what they're going to pay me. And if I take Medicare patients, I can't take patients that pay me cash. So, you know, there's a lot of difficulty there. And I hope they're going to wake up. Now, the American Association for Physicians and Surgeons is a much different organization. It's for freedom in medicine. And it's out of Tucson, I believe. Could someone bring me my water, please? And that's a great group. They understand. And there's somebody that if you aren't aware of, you should be. I think it's aapsonline.org. And they're a great group. They have a great newsletter. And they have lots of book reviews on books that you'll want to know about and avoid. Any other questions? Yes, in the back.
Yeah, I was wondering if you're familiar with MAPS and where you think the MAPS model and psychedelic drugs fit into the regulatory system?
What is the MAPS model? I'm not familiar with the
MAPS is
acronym.
Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies. They've been conducting studies, barely getting government approval, but occasionally getting government approval for the administration of psychedelic drugs, mostly in the treatment of post-traumatic stress disorder. So if you don't know about MAPS, I guess I'm just wondering more generally where you think psychedelic drugs might fit into the regulatory model, or how they compare and contrast with more traditional psychoactive and other drugs.
Well, I'm not familiar with MAPS, but I believe that treatment with any kind of drug, the psychedelics or whatever, certainly would be looked into more in a different type of model. Right now, the FDA can basically squash any drug development program just by saying they don't find it politically correct. I mean, they don't say it that way, but that's basically what happens. And that's what is happening. That's why the people you're referring to have a hard time getting funding or getting the study off the ground. I think it's still pretty much against the law to do studies on marijuana, for example. It's very, very difficult to do that. And any attempt to do that is met with a lot of red tape, at least. Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, just I think even the AAOP and the pediatricians are joining in one of the other groups again tomorrow night. I wanted to ask you a follow-up question on your comments about the IP protections. The understanding I have of what you were saying a few moments ago is that it's essentially a matter of the goodwill that's been built up between when the drug can be brought to market and when generics comes out. And I can understand that compensating for 20%, 30% markup. I don't see compensating for 200%, 300% price differential. So is what you're saying then that intermediary period before the generic comes on market is where all of the R&D costs would be earned back? And if so, what kind of limitation do you see that presenting to the R&D expenditure for each drug and that limit?
Yes, it's okay. The question is about the big difference between generics and new drugs that come out, and is that period, that short period, where the drug company has to recover the costs. And the short answer is yes, that is the period, but they aren't just recovering for that one that's on the market. They're recovering for the 10 failures that also cost them, millions of dollars. And that's where things get tricky, because there are many drugs that are effective and are safe, but they never make it to market because the cost of developing them is so high that they won't be able to recover their costs. I think the last study I saw, and I have to admit it's about 10 years old, was that only 3 out of 10 new drugs recover their costs. So what you're really paying for in any particular drug that's successful is you're paying for all those failures.
Would that be the case? And I would love to believe that we can get rid of the patent laws. There's so many problems with the patent office that you know, I believe. But from what I'm hearing you say there, that's not entirely consistent with that, because you know, if you wanted to bring together a drug that's going to take a lot of R&D for that and for the other 10 studies that failed, isn't it more effective nowadays? Isn't it easier nowadays to reverse engineer a drug that comes out and produce a generic based on that? Isn't that time window between the presentment of the original company's drug and the generics climbing on board going to be that much shorter if you don't have patents?
Okay, well, I think maybe there's a little bit of confusion about my point there, and I'm sorry I was unclear. The reason that we have to have patent protection today is because development costs are so high that the only way they can be recovered is through a monopoly system, which is what the patent system is. However, in the days when development costs were much less, you didn't need that monopoly protection. You got first to the market, if you were lucky, and you knew you'd recover your costs and make lots of money, and then your competitors actually would come in with their second to the market and third to the market, and they would take a small percentage of your market, maybe 5–10%, but it would be enough because the development costs were so low. But today they aren't. It's virtually impossible to recover them. I would say it's impossible to recover them without the patent protection. So the regulations have made patent protection necessary. This has always been a dilemma for me since, for example, I developed a cream. I had breast cancer, I had to have radiation treatment, and I knew when talking to the other women that I was going to be in big trouble because I burned very easily. So I developed a cream that protected me from that. And then my neighbors started using it for their cuts and bruises and things like that, and I found it worked against wrinkles, scars, a lot of other things, certain types of tumors. So now I have this dilemma, you know. Do I patent it so it can be developed and people can use it, or do I not patent it and not be able to develop it? You see, it's a dilemma.
Tell it at your table outside.
So I'm just trying to, yeah, and this is a very personal example of how, you know, how that, it gets all twisted, you know. It's very difficult. Okay, yes, over there, you've had your hand up for a long time.
This whole idea of these undue influences and codex, I was wondering, what's your opinion on the influence drug companies have had since they've been allowed to advertise on TV and mass market advertising? It seems to have increased their influence to the detriment of, say, natural health. Do you see I'm curious, as a libertarian, you phase most couldn't advertise prescriptions to the mass market?
Well, the question was, what do I think about advertising, direct to the consumer advertising that drug companies do today? And there's been some studies done on this which are very interesting. And those studies show that when the drug companies can advertise, people go, oh, well, I didn't realize there was a treatment for this condition, or I didn't realize this was serious. I'll go in and have my doctor check me out. And so what we're finding is that there's a great educational component to these advertisements, and that the net effect of that is that people, especially people who aren't so well off, who might not, you know, read anything medically related or investigate things like supplements and things on their own, when they hear it on television, which is their medium of education, say, oh, okay, I'll look into this, and they go to their doctor, and then they find out they have high blood pressure, diabetes, or, you know, that some condition that they had was caused by these. So it's actually having a net positive effect on health because people are discovering things that they can do something about, whereas before they had no knowledge. So that seems to be the predominant effect, which is very nice because I believe that liberty works, and here it is, it does. Drug companies advertise. There are other problems, as you mentioned, with the supplements. You know, does that push out the supplements? But the reason the supplements are having a problem is because they have a limited playing field. They can't, you know, let's talk about the fish oil example, perfect example. Those of you who follow nutrition know that fish oil is just about a miracle. And it's been touted for a lot of different things, and it's really, really great. I had a friend who may be the only woman to have survived idiopathic pulmonary, not obstruction, what's the other one? Fibrosis, thank you. Idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis. She might be the only survivor of that. What we did, because it's so, the syndrome looks a lot like liver disease. I know that, I mean, a clinician can understand this maybe, but anyhow, I started her on fish oil and some other nutrients, and she's okay. The only cure for this normally is transplant. She was on the transplant list. You have usually 2 years after diagnosis to live. 5 years later, you know, she's got a personal trainer working out all the time. It's great. Okay, fish oil is great. That's what I'm trying to get across. Now, it's so great that one drug company said, you know, I think we're going to spend all that money jumping through the FDA hoops. And they did. So you can get prescription fish oil. Believe it or not. Of course, your copay is the same amount of money that you would pay if you went to the drugstore and bought pharmaceutical grade fish oil. I know because my sister tried to do it because she's one of the people that needs it. So it's very interesting that the drug reps can go to the doctors of this company and say, our fish oil is the only fish oil that has been proven and approved by the FDA for all this stuff. So this is what you should give your patients. But you see, a regular fish oil manufacturer, pharmaceutical grade fish oil, should be able to do the same thing, but they can't. It's against the law. So that's where the rubber meets the road on that one. And that's why these regulations, which are what lets the FDA do that, are so destructive. So if you want fish oil and you're willing to pay the prescription price for it and your doctor prescribes it, then you can get it, but it will cost the whole system much more than if you could just buy it over the counter. So our healthcare costs go up. It doesn't matter who pays. This is a point you need to make to people who want universal healthcare. It doesn't matter who pays. As long as the healthcare costs are high, there's going to be healthcare rationing, just like we talked about here. That's the only way the system can work. You've got to bring the healthcare costs down, and trying to mandate decreases won't work. The only way you can do it is get rid of the waste, and the waste is in the regulation. Yes?
Do you find that the pharmaceutical companies will withdraw a working drug at the end of the patent life cycle to put in a new drug to replace that?
Oh, I'm glad you asked that question. That's one of the reasons that our drugs are less safe. Basically what he asked was, will the drug companies put in a new drug to replace one that's off patent? And the answer is yes, in a way. I mean, they also have their own generic of their own drug, but what they will do is they will develop, because now they have another dilemma. The generic companies are going to compete. The only way they can get rid of that competition is to patent a different type of drug, maybe slightly different, develop it all over again. Now the thing is, they don't know anything about the side effects of this new drug. So instead of using an older drug where we know the side effects and we know what to be careful with, we start with a new drug where the safety effects are not known, where there's a higher risk that will do something that we don't realize until it's too late. So this is one reason why drugs are less safe today, is because even if all the drug did was work for another indication, another disease for which it wasn't originally approved for, it's usually cheaper to develop or it makes more economic sense, I should say. It's not cheaper. It makes more economic sense to start a whole new drug program with a whole new drug rather than use the old one and get an approval for the other disease. Why? Because the patent will run out by the time they get approval for that other disease. So they've got to start all over again so they can have the monopoly protection, so they might be able to recover their development costs. Now I know this sounds kind of convoluted, and it is. There's a reason it sounds convoluted. It is. It's crazy. It's crazy. And once you start understanding how these regulations work against you and drive up healthcare costs, not just in pharmaceuticals, but every other one, then you realize what the problem with healthcare is. And then when people come to you and say, well, we need universal healthcare, you know what to tell them. Universal healthcare means healthcare rationing. There's only one way that we can all get the healthcare we need, and that is to make sure that we have the freedom to get innovation, inexpensive supplements when that's the right answer, breakthrough drugs when it's not, and the only way we're going to do this and keep costs down is get rid of the waste, and all the waste, well, maybe not all of it, but almost all the waste is in the regulatory system.
What is off the list and assumes, just for the sake of argument, that it was possible to repeal these amendments to the development costs? If you didn't patent the drug, wouldn't the health insurers insist that patients use the generic as soon as they were legally allowed to do so?
Okay, the question was, if you didn't have patents, if you got rid of these amendments, and wouldn't insurance companies insist that you use the generic as soon as possible? Well, the answer to that is there really wouldn't be a difference between generic and patented for the most part, because if you're not patenting the drug, you're just getting it to market, then in essence, it is a generic drug. But what keeps the drug company profiting in that situation is the fact that they were first to market and have brand name. Now that used to be really, really important, and the reason is that not all companies had the same quality. So what would happen is companies would actually advertise that our anti-serum or whatever, our serum has never had this type of reaction, some common side effect or something, or our medicine doesn't have this problem. We have a record of safety, and this is how they were advertised. And people who use brand names, actually did that because they felt it was worth paying a few cents more and getting that safety factor. That was part of how the market protected people. And also, of course, there were other third-party evaluations. One thing I wanted to share with you that you might not be aware of is that the FDA doesn't do any drug testing. No, not one. The drug company does the drug testing, they write up the results, and then they send literally a truckload or two of paper to the FDA. The FDA reads the paper, and if they think everything looks on the up and up, then they approve the drug. But the company does its own testing. There isn't any third-party testing. So the FDA isn't testing drugs. That's an important thing for you to be aware of. And that's why there's been some drug scandals, because you can imagine with all this monetary pressure that sometimes things aren't put quite the way they could be. Now, I have to tell you, it is actually hard to do that because of the process. Information goes through so many hands before it gets to the FDA. You would think at some point it would get caught, and it would most usually do that. But if you really had a concerted effort to mask something, it's possible to do it. Whereas if you had third-party testing, you wouldn't have that problem either. Any other questions? Okay, let's looking at it first.
What was the time delay between the first one and the second one before it happens?
Well, that depended. Usually, there'd be 2 or 3 companies working on the same type of drug at the same time. And when one turned out to be, you kind of knew your competitor was ahead of you to some extent. And so when that happens, you might reposition your drug if you're going to be second to market, by which I mean if the other company was putting out a certain dose or a certain method of delivery, like oral versus nasal or something, you might change that in the process. And sometimes there would matter months in between the two, and sometimes there would be many months. It just depended on how far the program was along. Now, the FDA, of course, can manipulate this. How do they do this? Well, if they know, of course, every drug company that's doing anything, because you have to let them know, otherwise you can't do the human studies. So some of the FDA examiners were taken to task because they played the game of keeping one drug company from getting to the market for the other one by simply demanding more studies. You see, when you submit stuff to the FDA, at any point in time they can say, I think you need more studies of this, this, and this, and this. And you don't dare object because you have, 10, 15 drugs in the pipeline, and if you get them upset about one drug, you're kind of nervous that maybe, they'll punish you by delaying your other ones. So now the FDA can actually manipulate who gets first to market. Yeah, so it's a whole nother factor. Yes, in the back.
I hear stories of my predecessor, Mark Chris, used to have a routine doing a speech. You grab a lecture board and go like this. And his point was, why do I think that this is tested by a private firm called Underwriters Laboratory. Is there, or was there, an institution like that in the drug industry that assured people without government intervention of the safety of their drugs?
The question was, is there something like Underwriters, or was there something like Underwriters Laboratory before the FDA came along to ensure that there was third-party testing and some types of safety testing? And the answer is yes. Even though the drug industry was pretty young, the AMA actually did tests and reported on them in their journal. Also, Consumers Research did so. There was something called Pharmaceutical Letters, which is still around today, which talked about the different drugs and their impact on patients. So there were a lot of different ways in which people knew about safety effects of drugs. And very interestingly enough, usually the increase in regulation followed some type of drug disaster. And the one that really began the safety testing at the FDA was an instance where an antibiotic was dissolved in an unsafe liquid. And that was because prior to that time, you didn't have a solution, it wasn't well absorbed. And they were trying to get something that's well absorbed, but they didn't do any testing, and it turned out not to be safe for children. And I bring this to your attention because the physicians who were paying attention to the AMA evaluation weren't using it because it had not been evaluated by them yet. So the market was protecting the physicians who paid attention to the testing that their own society did. And incidentally, even though that looks like it was negligence on the part of the drug manufacturer, the chemist who put that together killed himself over that incident because he was so distressed by it. So clearly it was a mistake, not some type of nefarious profit-making motive, because there really is no profit in killing your customer. In fact, it's very detrimental to the health of the company. The thalidomide, this wasn't thalidomide, this was sulfenamide.
No, I'm saying that my recollection, the stuff I read on thalidomide was the company was the one that pulled the drug off the market, not the drug trade.
Well, in the case of thalidomide, of course, it came out in Europe. It hadn't been approved in the U.S. And what happened with thalidomide, just for those who don't know the history, it was actually a drug that was saving lives. The reason being, it was a very safe sleeping drug, and a lot of people were dying from barbiturate overdose. You know, you've heard the stories of Marilyn Monroe and other famous people who've died. Well, that's what was happening. People were taking overdoses. Not on purpose, but just because it was so easy to overdose. Well, thalidomide didn't have that problem. It was great. You could take a lot of it. But what happened was, pregnant women started taking it because they started realizing that it helped their morning sickness. And it did. But the problem is that they took it in a 4-week period during their pregnancy, and it had to be that 4-week period. They had children that were born either without limbs or with shrunken limbs. And at first the company, I think, kind of backpedaled on that. They could hardly believe it. And this is a natural tendency. You know, you want your drug out there. It's been good, so good, you know, you can't believe it's got something like this wrong. But this is why, it's what I was saying earlier. At the time, we didn't appreciate how sensitive the fetus was compared to the mother. We just didn't have that knowledge. At least most people didn't. It was out there, but it wasn't well known. So at first they didn't think it was really happening, and then they finally withdrew it, of course. And the company went bankrupt, if I recall. Now what was interesting is that the FDA banned this drug. It didn't say, well, men can take it. It just banned it, okay? It never approved it, and it wasn't going to consider it. Well, what's interesting is this drug happens to work against a disease that has a long history, a very long history of making people miserable. It works against leprosy. And it's now finally, after much trauma on the part of the people who are trying to help people with leprosy, is being tested. So, you know, no drug is perfectly safe. No drug is always effective. It depends on the individual and what you're using it for. And that's why it's so important to be careful on this. Now, let's see, I wanted to see if anybody else who hasn't spoken, you didn't have a chance yet.
I was wondering if any of the drugs that were on the market prior to the regulations are in peril.
Yes, the question was, are any of the drugs on the market before the regulations in peril? The answer is yes. What the FDA did is they said, okay, if you're on the market already, you have to bring us proof that your drug works, and if you don't, then you can't market it anymore. Now, of course, there were so many drugs on the market at that point, they really, and this was kind of before they had defined everything well, so what they did is they asked a panel of physicians to rule on whether they were effective. Now, let's get this straight. The new drugs had to jump through all these hoops and get 2 US studies that showed certain statistical significance, but the old drugs got to have a panel of physicians, which is what the old system was about. Very strange. Anyhow, so this panel of physicians ruled that only about 10% of the drugs were worthless, and even that was questionable because some of the manufacturers said, hey, our drug has been supplanted by new drugs now. It's, not as good as the newer drugs on the market. We're not going to spend all our money bringing you evidence of efficacy. We're just going to take it off the market. It's just not worth fighting for. So that 10% is high. But what the FDA did then, as years went by, is it started saying, well, these drugs that are still on the market from before 62, we need a little more evidence. And they started requiring more and more. So some of these drugs are, even now, being taken off the market. Sometimes because the manufacturer simply doesn't want to go through all the hassle of taking what's now a generic drug and bringing it through in a way that would satisfy the FDA. Way in the back.
Has there been any difference as far as the regulation that's in a lot of the drugs, as far as treatment versus cures? I've noticed it used to be where, say, something like polio was found out that they were developing a drug to actually cure it. Do you think the regulation since 1962 has really prevented drugs to develop that would potentially be cured, say, for something like AIDS?
The question was, have the 62 regulations prevented development of cures for things like AIDS? Well, the answer is clearly yes. I mean, what's happened is, if for a drug to make up the increasing development costs, it has to be taken and marketed by a lot of people. I mean, a lot of people have to take it. A lot of money has to come through the system, right? So there are many, many diseases where not everybody in the population is going to take it. A small segment of people want to take it. So what's happening in those cases is the manufacturers oftentimes are not developing the drug. It just doesn't make any economic sense unless they're charging a lot of money. A lot of money. And then they're getting a lot of bad press for it. You hear some of these drugs that are like $5,000 a month. Usually they're biologics, what we call biologics. In other words, they're not chemicals per se. They're proteins or some other more difficult to process entity. And so they are very expensive. But if they save your life, you might be willing to, or somehow find a way to pay that, But that's why they have what they call the Orphan Drug Development Program. Supposedly, the FDA was going to help manufacturers to develop drugs for these small populations, but it hasn't worked out that well because, of course, they really don't change the regulations that much, and there's still a lot of red tape. So yes, there's a lot of things I'm sure that could be developed. In fact, at Upjohn, what I remember, we sat down to choose the drugs to develop. We'd look at the market. If it was a small market, we said, we can't do it. The development costs will be too much. So there are many drugs out there that could cure or help people prevent their suffering that never come to market. Let's see. You haven't had a chance yet. Oh, the green, did you have a question? Oh, okay. Go ahead.
We just took our dogs and cats to the vet, and I've noticed how expensive those medications are. What's the process? Is it the same process for the animals?
Okay. The question is, our veterinary bills are getting high. Is the process for drugs for them the same as with people? Well, it's not the same, but it's getting more and more regulated. And of course, there are people who are taking, but still it's cheaper than drugs for people. So there are individuals who take and go to their vet and get the drugs for their animals and actually take them themselves. That's one way they're controlling their health care costs. Now, I'm not saying you should go out and do that. I'm just pointing out, please don't say I'm recommending this. I'm not. I'm just pointing out that that's one of the things that people are doing. There are also people who suggest cutting your pill in half and taking less of it so that your medication will extend out. Well, if you need that full dose, that's not a good idea. But if you can get along with half a dose, that cuts your costs. So this is the kind of thing that people are doing in order to make up for these prices that are just getting out of sight, and they're just going to get worse. Okay, have I exhausted all the questions?
Over here.
I've got one more over here. Okay, I'll take one more and then I'll leave. Oh, vaccinations. Oh my goodness, yes. Oh. It's getting almost impossible to develop a vaccine unless it's really something that the government wants badly, because there you're dealing with the biological again. And there's less quality control in terms of getting everything exactly the same in each dose, et cetera, et cetera. So the vaccine manufacturers they're very frustrated. Many of them have gone out of business. So that's a whole nother story. In fact, that would make a good libertarian paper if you're so inclined. I know there are a few people who have dealt with that before, but the situation there is just getting worse. Okay, well, I want to thank you all for your attention.
Whole speech.
And I want to return my laser pointer substitute to whoever gave it to me. Thank you.
Thank you. And don't forget, Dr. Ruwart will be out signing her books. Give her a couple minutes to relax, right? Yes? Yes. No, it's my mandatory. Leave her alone for a few minutes. Two quick things. The Watchmen at 10 o'clock is sold out at IMAX, so don't drive up there. We are